All right. Yeah, thank you, Chris. I appreciate it. All right. I am the entomological programs manager for the North Carolina Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. And what that entails is that I assist with the detections of emerging plant pests that are coming into North Carolina and enforce regulations for different insect plant pests that we have present in the state. Um, and this has become a continually growing field, for better or for worse, just as a consequence of increased globalization. I'm going to guess that a lot of us today have a 2-day shipping set up, and due in part to that, things are moving around the world at a much faster rate than they used to. And things aren't spending as much time at sea anymore. So we're more likely to get viable insects coming ashore through globalized trade, just through hitchhiking invasive pests. Now, less than 0.1% of introduced species become truly invasive, meaning that they cause large-scale ecological or economic problems. However, with that increased rate of shipping and introduction, we are just getting a lot more of them over the last few decades. For a species to become invasive, it must have a favorable habitat or host material when it arrives in a new place. They're typically able to outcompete native species or fill a new ecological niche. And the native host may lack immunity to those exotic pests. Invasive species often have a high reproductive rate. They may emerge earlier than other species that fulfill a similar role in ecology. They may lack natural enemies, and they may be able to spread more quickly by hitchhiking, for instance. And with invasive species, prevention is often the best approach to dealing with them. So, international shipping safeguards do exist, but they're not foolproof. The convention of organizations that handle this are called International Plant Protection Organizations. Here in the US, it's the United States Department of Agriculture, um, APHIS, Animal Plant Health Inspection Service, Plant Protection Quarantine Organization. Um, And, it's not just that we're concerned with other things coming into our state and country, but other countries are also concerned with things that we may be shipping to them. We have our own native pests here that they don't want to become invasive there either. So that's a big part of what we do with the State Department of Agriculture is certify plant material before it's exported to make sure that it meets entry requirements for the receiving country. Um, However, there's only so much inspection that can be done before a material leaves its home place, and it's unfortunately not foolproof. So the second line of defense to that is early detection and rapid response, which includes surveying for pests in areas that are most vulnerable to introduction using the most effective tools. Because you could look for a pest everywhere, but then you're kind of just dropping a point on a map blindly and hoping you find it. But by using more fine-tuned tools, you maximize your chances of finding that pest in an area where it has available host material. For instance, a pheromone-baited trap shown here. And the reason that detecting pests early is so crucial is that, if we detect a pest at low population levels, then we have a better chance at potentially eradicating or preventing it from establishing altogether. And that's the goal with any invasive pest is finding it before it really causes a problem. And there are large scale problems that are large scale programs that deal with this problem. The biggest one is the Cooperative Agricultural Pest Survey, which is the role I had up until March of this year, leading these surveys for the state of North Carolina. Um, It is an early detection plant pest for plant pest program that exists in all states and territories funded by USDA. Um, Basically, there's a group of scholars that run through a list of pests around the globe every year and kind of determine, what are the new emerging pests? Is there a risk to any U.S. state that could suffer if it was introduced, and what level of economic impact we would expect to see? And from there, they assign a risk grade, and the things that get the highest risk grade move into a list for CAP surveys to consider. And then each state holds a meeting with other subject matter experts as a part of their CAPS committee, and determine which pests would be most damaging should they show up. So on the right here, we have the list of the 41 different pest species that we're surveying for in North Carolina this year. But the big takeaway from this very wordy slide is that CAPS sets the standard for new pest surveys, and we hope to always get negative survey data, and that negative survey data bolsters our exports because it's kind of helps show that a pest isn't present in an area of our state. So as an example, we're going to get into the Great Pest Survey. It currently consists of 3 different pests. We talked about using fine-tuned methods to try to detect different pests. Whenever possible, we try to use lure that's baited with a pheromone trap that smells normally like a female attractant pheromone for the species. Sometimes it is an aggregative pheromone. And then we'll pair that with a trap that the insect also responds to. So there's a group at USDA that's all they do. They just determine which lure and trap combination are the best for each invasive insect, and they do this all under quarantine, of course. However, there are some pests that don't respond to a pheromone, or we haven't figured out what that pheromone is yet. And there we always have to do visual surveys, though we may be able to supplement it with different kinds of traps. So for European grapevine moth and Christmas fairy webworm in our Great Pest Survey, we're able to use those pheromone traps for detection. But for spotted lanternfly, we do have to do visual surveys, which we then supplement with lampshade traps. So of over 20 different types of traps that USDA tried out, the only one that they responded to was this lampshade trap, which is basically made of 2 rolls of roofing shingle wrapped around a tree and stapled on to create a small space for them to go up in. And the rough, warm surface really seems to make them decide that they would like to lay eggs there. And again, it's a good trap, but we've only shown so far that it's effective for kind of capturing eggs in areas where spotted lanternfly is already established. So it's not clear yet if it's a good detection method. And we'll get into spotted lanternfly more here in a bit. So as I kind of clued at, with formal surveys, there are a few gaps in our detection capabilities, especially with pests that don't use a pheromone lure or a trap attractant combo. We do have to do those visual surveys, and we're very limited by our labor and funding, and we just simply cannot look everywhere. The other thing too is that those surveys are normally science-based. They're built on evidence of pests in other areas of the world. But we have had a lot of issues with invasive pests over the last few decades, with species that are not pests in their native range. For instance, emerald ash borer is a big one. And typically in the entomology world, if an insect isn't a pest, there's normally not much research done on it, and early detection surveys haven't been developed because it's not something that people are on the lookout for. And unfortunately, damage may not be noticeable before pest populations get way too large to eradicate or even potentially contain. And that's why we need your help to find bad bugs. Because we aren't everywhere, but you all are. And, you know, typically with invasive insects, the general public doesn't necessarily notice them until they're a huge problem. But my hope is that by us talking today, you learn to recognize some of the big ones we're on the lookout for in North Carolina, and let us know if you see them, and then hopefully we can move a little further down on the invasion curve and hopefully find these things before they become a large, invasive, and established problem. And so with that, we're going to move on into the insects we're fighting in this bad bug brigade. So we're going to start off by talking about some of the pests we have established here and the programs that we have in place to combat them. Spotted lanternfly is going to be our deep dive case study, and we'll spend a little bit less time on the other species. And then from there, we're going to move into the insects, three insects that we do not have in North Carolina as far as we know, but we absolutely do not want to become established here. So let's get started with spotted lanternfly. So contrary to its name, it is not a fly. And even though it has a kind of pretty wing pattern, it's not a moth either. It's actually a plant hopper and a member of the family Fulgoridae, which is much more closely related to things like cicadas. They use piercing sucking mouth parts, basically a straw, to suck the sap out of several woody species. They're pests of grape, hops, and about 130 other hosts. They don't really seem to feed on conifers, but beyond that, it seems to be up in the air whether anything else could be a host. Um, they're also a nuisance pest by virtue of their heavy feeding and their mating swarm behavior, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. They're native to Asia originally, basically from northern China all the way down to Vietnam. So if you rotate the globe, that lines up pretty well with North America in terms of climate. Um, they become invasive in a lot of the northeastern US and mid-Atlantic. And we found our first population in Forsyth County in June of 2022, and then in Gopher County shortly after, basically in a community that lies on the border of those two counties. Um, Currently, we don't have a quarantine in place, but we are, as the state agriculture department, are actively surveying for and treating in infested areas to try to prevent its spread. Um, and this insect can spread on basically anything that's stored outside. It can hitchhike on any life stage. It will lay its eggs on any flat surface, and adults and nymphs are not good flyers. And so they tend to, in nature, climb up trees and then try to, catch some air and fall this style down from the tops of trees. However, they can't really tell the difference between trees and trucks, so they end up getting into vehicles and shipments fairly often. So, like I mentioned, spotted lanternfly causes a lot of issues just due to its feeding. So, let's see if I can get my mouse up there. So, these are its mouth parts right here. It basically is a straw that it sticks into the plant, and then basically passively allows that sap to flow through its body. And inside, it's trying to concentrate that sugar and then expel the excess water out of the other end. However, that is not a perfect process, and the stuff that comes out of the other end still has some sugar content and can be sweet and sticky. So, the nice name we have for that is honeydew. And because they are feeding passively and they go after plants with high turgor pressure, people in heavily infested areas will say things like, it looks like it's raining in my backyard, but it's really just spotted lanternflies feeding. And as a demonstration here on the right, we've got the top of a truck that was parked under an infested tree for just an hour, and it's already just covered in honeydew. So you can imagine that would not make for an enjoyable time in your backyard in the summer. Um, The sweetness of that honeydew can also attract stinging insects, kind of similar to having soda at a barbecue and a yellow jacket comes up to it while you're trying to just enjoy your meal in peace. Similar kind of thing happens here, but it's a little more difficult to move a tree out of the way. That honeydew also allows for a substance called sooty mold to grow. It's kind of powdery black fungus that just grows on top of that honeydew. And while it doesn't impact other plants directly, it blocks out sunlight, so it can prevent understory plants from getting the sunlight they need to conduct photosynthesis, kind of choke them out. And then with a full season of heavy feeding, you can end up with honeydew and sooty mold just kind of stacking over and over on each other, kind of like creating a gross lasagna. That's just a really nice habitat for other fungi to grow. So you can end up with these large white foul-smelling fungal mats forming at the base of the tree. So these are the kinds of things that we're trying to prevent here by keeping spotted lanternfly down. Aside from all of those issues with feeding, spotted lanternfly can just be a nuisance in its own right. On the left here, there's a tree that's covered in egg masses of spotted lanternfly. Every one of those egg masses has between 30 to 50 individual eggs underneath it. So you can imagine there's going to be a huge population there in spring. The nymphs tend to cluster together and all kind of feed on the same tree at once. And then the adults have what's called a mating swarm, which normally lasts about 6 to 8 weeks, typically in August, September. And once they decide that they're going to congregate somewhere to meet their mate, they kind of create these kind of watering holes. And once they determine that that's going to be their mating swarm location, it's really hard to get them away from it. The photo on the right is a cherry tree in a gentleman's backyard. And it's actually a still taken from a YouTube video where you can see him trying to swat them out of the way and just brush them down, and they're just immediately replaced by more spotted lanternflies. So it definitely makes for a less than fun summer. And while trees kind of make sense as a place for these insects to aggregate, it's seemingly random in some other ways. So this is a news story from Philadelphia, where Chipotle actually was chosen as the watering hole for that season by the lanternflies. You can see here just a pile of them with a reporter for scale next to it. And for whatever reason, they just really like that Chipotle entrance. And it got to the point where anytime a customer opened that door, a few lanternflies would fly in. It was starting to become a food health issue. So fortunately they had another entrance, but they did have to close that one down to avoid the lanternflies getting in folks' food. So, spotted lanternfly is one of those pests that isn't a pest in its native range, and part of that has to do with its preferred host trees. Its preferred host trees are also invasive here in the US and have had a big head start and kind of laid out the red carpet for it. So, Tree of Heaven is the most preferred host in its native range, and it's become very prominent in the Piedmont, especially, and a little bit into the mountains. It's got about a 250-year head start on spotted lanternfly, and it really likes to thrive in disturbed habitats like the sides of roadways, rail lines, parking lots, that sort of thing. Also, kind of aggressively prevents other plants from growing through allelopathy. It smells like burnt or rotten peanut butter. From a distance, it can look like a walnut or a sumac, but aside from that smell, it also has cantaloupe-like texture on the bark and heart-shaped leaf scars. And those seed pods, the samaras, that initially made it attractive as a nursery plant, means that it produces hundreds of thousands of seeds per year that can stay good in the seed bank for up to 10 years. So invasive tree in its own right, for sure. The next most preferred um, host of spotted lanternfly in its native range is Chinaberry, which is common throughout the South and especially in the coastal plain here in North Carolina. And it's had a pretty big head start too. So almost 200 years now. Um, it also has kind of a foul smell, more of a fishy kind of smell. And also very prolific at producing seeds and kind of suckers out, similar to Tree of Heaven. Also really likes those disturbed habitats. So as far as identifying Chinaberry goes, it does have the multiply pinnate leaf structure here. So this is all considered one leaf. The easiest way to identify Chinaberry, I would say, would be by its seeds. So those seeds will be yellow when it's and round when it's attached to the tree, and when they fall off, they turn brown. And they'll normally be littering the ground around it. Um, the leaf scar of Chinaberry is pretty unique. It looks like a certain copyright mouse, or some people say it's a monkey face, whichever you prefer. Uh, for Chinaberry's bark, when it first starts forming, it's kind of that smooth chocolatey brown. As it continues to mature, it gets this beautiful variegated pattern with the younger bark showing through beneath. And then as it gets fully mature, then those kind of grow together and it creates a very shaggy bark. And then it has those very showy purple flowers as well. Um, but again, two trees that like disturbed habitats and are becoming invasive, are becoming invasive here in areas where spotted lanternfly is most likely to hitchhike to, and that is creating a situation which we call invasional meltdown, where an ideal habitat is created by one invasive species for another. So, and as you can see here, spotted lanternfly really has spread with human-assisted movement, kind of along a lot of those roadsides and railways, which run parallel to a lot of these. So, um, spotted lanternfly first was found in the US in 2014 in Pennsylvania, and since then it managed to spread to 17 states in just 9 years. In North Carolina, we had 19 interceptions of a spotted lanternfly between 2019 to now. And we found our first established population in the Kernersville area, which lies on the border of Forsyth and Guilford County, back in June of 2022. Ever since then, we have surveyed over 3,000 properties for spotted lanternfly and Tree of Heaven. And if they have one or the other, we tend to try to set up that property for treatment acknowledgement as well, and work with the landowners on management. And then we're also continuing to conduct detection surveys at sites that are most vulnerable for damage and introduction. And I will say, to the point of, we're looking, but we can't be everywhere for these visual survey pests. Prior to detecting spotted lanternfly, we had conducted over 10,000 surveys between 2015 and 2022. Now we're up to over 12,000 surveys. Um, and to date, there's only been one other location where one of our surveyors found spotted lanternfly that wasn't in response to a public report. So your help really does make a huge difference here. But again, spotted lanternfly moves so far because it is so hard to find and is just really good at hitchhiking. Um, The egg masses are the primary risk of spread because they are so cryptic. Here on this birch tree that's at eye level, there's actually 4 egg masses right there. You can imagine how much more difficult it would be if they were laid, underneath the wheel well of a truck, or in between slats on a pallet or something like that. So because of that, we are always looking for improved tools. We actually have 2 detector dogs that are trained to sniff out spotted lanternfly egg masses in the state, and they are litter mates, Goose and Kita, so brother and sister. Um, So those eggs will be present throughout the winter. They're typically laid in September. You'll have to bear with this graphic a little bit. It is originally from Pennsylvania. We're just a little bit warmer here, so we'll talk about how this time frame shifts a little bit. Those eggs will be present throughout winter, and then we'll have the nymphs hatch sometime, typically in very late March or early April. Those first 3 instars will be black with white spots, and then that third instar will get some red coloration, which in the insect world normally means like I taste bad or I'm poisonous, something like that. It's also pretty typical that we'll see that that egg hatch kind of drawn out. Because insects are cold-blooded, it could be influenced by something as simple as, this egg mass was laid on the shaded side of the tree and the other egg mass was laid on sunny side of the tree and got more degree day development, we call it, got more warmth throughout the winter and just hatched out sooner. So it's pretty typical to see those combined life stages too. But yeah, those 4th instars we'll typically see early June here through July, and we'll start seeing adults as early as late June. They'll slowly ramp up, and then really it's around August, September, we start seeing them returning to areas that they kind of have chosen as their mating sites. We haven't seen swarms to the same level that we have up north yet, thank goodness. I think it's in part due to our management efforts, but we do definitely notice when they start coming back to an area. But after that mating swarm, it's interesting. They'll continue to just persist in the environment, definitely without so much of a frenzy, but they will just be around from, June through November, December. Up north, they're typically killed by a hard freeze. We don't get so many of those down here, but we do notice that they start kind of flagging off in November, December. They're pretty much done. So, as I mentioned, here's a life cycle that's fine-tuned a little bit more to our Kernersville population in partnership with NC State. And the flip side of having invasive species with characteristics like emerging earlier than most other insects and things like that is that it does help fine-tune treatment schedules to the phenology of this host. And phenology is just, what life stages you see at different times of year. So for instance, we typically start treating nymphs shortly after they hatch. At that time in Kernersville, the only other thing really going on in the landscape is red maples are just barely beginning to leaf out. So there's not really much else out in the way of insect life there. So we feel a little more comfortable conducting treatments then. And then we also tend to target treatments for those late nymph instars. They're very heavily on Tree of Heaven then. And we'll kind of do systemic treatments there where we encapsulate it inside that invasive tree that our native insects don't really recognize as food, and kind of fight an invasive with an invasive that way. Okay. So that was our deep dive on spotted lanternfly. We're going to kind of quickly go through the rest of these pests here. The other big insect that we have a huge regulatory program for in the state is spongy moth, formerly known as European gypsy moth. It just recently had a name change. This one is a true moth, and the caterpillar stage are defoliators of several hardwood species. Oaks are its most favorite, and severe feeding can, year on year, eventually kill trees. And the hairs on the outside of the caterpillar are mildly irritating in areas where they get up to huge numbers. There can be enough hairs floating just in the air that it can cause respiratory issues for people too. So they're originally native to Europe and have become invasive in much of the northeastern US since the 1800s. Excuse me. Currently, we have Currituck County and part of Dare County under quarantine. Um, with established populations there. And then throughout the rest of the state, we don't really have established populations, but we are actively on the lookout. So we put out somewhere around 16,000 traps every year. Um, they look like this for the most part, or they might be a green milk carton style trap. So if you see something like that when you're out and about, particularly after April, it's very likely that you're looking at a spongy moth trap put out by NCDA. Much like spotted lanternfly, they're also capable of laying their eggs on any flat surface, so there's a risk of spreading them on anything stored outside in winter. But their life stages are also very showy. So the caterpillars have blue and red dots along with their hairs. The males are brown with these very large feathery antennae, which they use to sniff out pheromones. The females look very similar to the males, but are white and normally flightless. The asterisk in there because in the European subspecies, which we're most likely to get, the females are flightless, but there are some subspecies in Asia where the females can fly and are capable of spreading even faster. And then the eggs have a fluffy or spongy appearance, which is one of the things that drove the name change. Um, Yeah, and this is kind of what the life cycle looks like for spongy moths. So, as you can see, it spends the majority of its lifetime in that egg stage where it's capable of being moved. So, definitely something to be on the lookout for during most months of the year. Another big regulatory program we have within North Carolina is imported fire ants. So, this is a true ant. It is damaging primarily through its aggressive stinging. It creates mounds in soil and sometimes in vehicles that poses a health risk to humans and animals, especially livestock. Um, it's originally native to South America and has since spread to a lot of the southeastern U.S. Currently, we have a quarantine in 79 of our counties. Um, that doesn't mean that people can't leave those counties. It just means that our plant pest specialists are um, responsible for conducting inspections or setting up compliance agreements with folks that are planning on moving regulated articles out of those counties. And primarily, we're looking for infested soil through those. So there's a possibility that a fire ant could be in any soil in any of those counties in the red there. So that could be plants sold by nurseries, for instance, dirty equipment from construction, or hay stored on the ground, that kind of thing. And as with the compliance agreement, normally our inspectors will go through and offer tips for those producers to make sure that things are stored properly in a way that is not conducive to fire ants establishing in that material, or setting up treatments in a way that is effective to prevent them from moving. Um, for their life cycle, adults tend to disperse in spring and summer, and new colonies will start appearing in late fall. Um, for fire ants, typically you need a trained eye to identify them under a microscope to tell one ant from another. But if you see a mound out in the field, typically the easiest way to tell is the way they respond to a mound disturbance. So um, if they come just boiling out of there, there's a good chance it's fire ant, not some other kind of ant. Another kind of easy way to tell is the vast differences in size that fire ant has. So most ant colonies only have 4 or 5 different sizes maximum, whereas fire ant will range all the way from 1 to 10 millimeters. And that's a queen there on the right. So that's it for insects that we have large regulatory programs for kind of to give you all a sense of, what goes into effect if something becomes more broadly established. Of course, this is a lot of work for everyone in NCDA, and we want to protect our natural resources and green industries for the people of North Carolina. Um, and now we're going to move into the insects that are not established here yet that we know of. But if you happen to see one, we'd like to know so that we can prevent something of this scale from happening in the state. So the first one we're going to talk about is the Asian longhorn beetle. It is a member of the family Cerambycidae. And while most beetles in that family only feed on trees that are already dead or dying, this one, for whatever reason, really likes to feed on healthy trees, and it can outright kill those trees. So it feeds on the inside of that tree, it's chewing right through the sapwood and the heartwood. It feeds on over 12 different genera. Maples are the most common, but it will also go after willows, elms, horse chestnuts, and buckeyes, birches, that kind of thing. Um, and through that feeding, it really weakens the structural integrity of those trees, which means that you can have much larger branches than you would expect fall down in storms. Um, it also, of course, ruins the value of the wood if you're hoping to, harvest that stand one day, for instance. Um, when you're out looking for an Asian longhorn beetle, you might find one of these very large beetles. Sometimes they can show up in pool filters and places like that, but you're much more likely to see signs of damage. So, Asian longhorn beetles may have you may be able to see the frass from the larva coming out of the other end. They're chewing through the tree, and what comes out the other side looks kind of like sawdust. So you can see that coming out of the tree with weeping sap. Um, you can see these oviposition pits. These are some fresh ones here, kind of a little reddish, where the female will chew a spot and then lay her egg. The larva will then tunnel through. So here's an old oviposition pit right here. When the larva starts tunneling through, the tree tries to heal itself around it, and there will be callousing underneath the bark and splitting. So you can see this kind of mummy mouth sort of damage. Um, and then it does spend its entire life in the tree up until adulthood, and when it exits, it creates this perfectly round exit hole. And it's pretty typical to see multiple stages of old and new damage all across a tree. So down here, you can actually see an exit hole that's healed over from a year or two before. Um, it does take a while for Asian longhorn beetle infestation to kill a tree, but unfortunately, there is no good way to treat it. So, getting into some more particulars on Asian longhorn beetle and its life cycle, its most preferred host in North America is red maple so far. Um, it typically has one generation every couple of years. And those signs of feeding can be seen in mid-spring. So we looked at the sawdust on the last slide. Here is some weeping sap around the sawdust-like frass coming out of the oviposition pit area. So that's a brand new larva just starting to tunnel through there. Um, the adults typically emerge in late spring. So in the South Carolina infestation, that's typically late April. And then in places like Massachusetts, that's, Memorial Day, kind of late May, early June. So we do have a big range of environments here in North Carolina, so you can have a broad range of potentially seeing this insect as well. Um, when the adults emerge, they do take their time to create a perfectly round exit hole before leaving the tree. They'll then, it's about the width of a number two pencil, I could say. And after they mate, they'll make those oviposition pits, lay their egg, the larva tunnel into the tree, pupate, come out as adults, and start the whole cycle over again. Let's see. Moving on to our final pest, I believe, box tree moth, or actually, no, not final. Our next pest, box tree moth. Um, This is a snout-nosed moth, a member of the family Crambidae. It is a very prolific defoliator of boxwood and is capable of destroying an established stand in just a few years. There are currently no other defoliating pests of boxwood present in North America. And typically, the way to tell box tree moth is by looking for caterpillars and then feeding damage. So they'll start off by feeding on the tender tissue on the underside of the leaf. And then as they grow, they're able to take bigger bites out of the leaf, which looks kind of like a cookie cutter bite out of the side. They'll start leaving frass behind with caterpillars typically is kind of a roundish greenish brown, caught in the webbing. And then as they continue to feed on the leaves, they'll eventually chew all the way down to the midrib, which is left behind and kind of creates this curly Q type of damage. And eventually you're left with something like this. Um, that's in a very severe infestation, though. So earlier on, it can be very difficult to tell if you have a box tree moth infestation. This time of year, especially, one thing you want to start looking for is leaves stuck together. So they will kind of wrap themselves in leaves to protect themselves while they're feeding and pupating, and then also as their larvae to overwinter. So um, box tree moth has been spread primarily through infested boxwood plant material, either whole plants or cuttings. It's originally native to northern Asia and has become invasive in Europe. It first showed up in North America and Ontario in 2018, flew across to New York in 2021, I believe, and then has made its way, unfortunately, to several other states as well. So here's what the life cycle of box tree moth looks like. As I mentioned, it overwinters as a caterpillar. If you peel apart those leaves that are stuck together, you'll see a little structure like this where they've kind of wrapped themselves up in silk, and there is a tiny caterpillar underneath there. But because they're overwintering as caterpillars, once it gets warm enough in spring, typically early April is what they're seeing, they're able to start feeding immediately on that boxwood that has also just come out of overwintering. Um, they'll then complete their larval instar development, pupate, emerge as adults, lay their eggs, and start the cycle over again. So in New York and Ontario, they're currently seeing 2 generations per year, but it is capable of having up to 5 generations per year. And I will say that for the adults, you are unlikely to see them because they are nocturnal, but um, it's a possibility that you might see something like that come up to your porch light in summer. So if you think you see it, please let me know. Okay, and now we're on to our final insect that we don't have in North Carolina yet, the yellow-legged hornet. So Vespa velutina is a true hornet, and we're concerned about it from the agriculture perspective because it is a predator of honeybees. At NCDA, we do regulate the honeybee industry as well. And this hornet actually coordinates attacks on honeybee hives. It's currently present in kind of the Savannah area of Georgia and then across the river in South Carolina. Um, Originally native to northern Asia and has become invasive in Europe as well. This is one of those that has kind of fallen through the cracks. It's typically spread by shipping containers or materials harboring embryo nests. So not a plant product that would be inspected before it leaves a point of origin. Also, those gravid queens typically overwinter after mating, so a single insect could potentially start a new colony. And they do move a lot slower in winter, so they could go unnoticed. So this hornet is a social wasp that constructs paper nests above ground, often in trees. The queens emerge and establish their nests in spring. Colonies develop over summer, and then the queens are produced in May and fall before they go into overwintering. So As I mentioned, there can be embryo nests, which start off about the size of a softball. And then as that colony continues to grow, they can end up reaching several feet across. So they are very large nests. Um, However, for the wasp itself, it is less than 2 inches long, and unlike the other giant hornet that we've heard about in the news, it's actually not the biggest one that we have here in North Carolina. We actually have European hornet, which is a close relative. It's a member of the same genus. It was introduced over 50 years ago and has become established. It's not caused a large ecological uh, disruption in North Carolina, and it's not a threat to honeybees. They're just kind of general scavengers, but they are typically a little bigger than Vespa velutina. Um, the biggest sign of yellow-legged hornet is, seeing bee colonies that have adult bees killed and left in the bottom of the hive box. But in any case, if you happen to see any of these insects anywhere in North Carolina where they're not known to be established, like I mentioned before, you are our first line of defense to potentially finding these and keeping them from becoming a big established problem. So what we ask is if you see something like this, please try to collect a specimen and freeze it. Take a photo with a size reference like a coin or a pin. Um, and then you can take a picture and either send an email to badbucket@cagr.gov, or if you think you see spotted lanternfly or yellow-legged hornet, we do have reporting tools that are set up for those that do require a picture to submit as well. And all we ask is that if you think you see one of these invasive insects, to please not share about it on social media until our investigation is complete. That way, we'll have verified the identity of the insect and have an idea about its general spread so that we can take those calls from the public when they start coming in. And with that, I'd like to thank everybody that helps make these invasive species management programs possible and detection programs possible. And I'd be happy to take any questions.
Awesome. Amy, thank you for the presentation. There's a couple of questions in the chat that I will read off to you. And then for anybody else, if you want to ask questions, you can feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question as well. To get us started, the first question we have is from somebody who says they live in a single family home and they have found mounds of fire ants in the ground near azalea bushes and in the right of way and in various places in the yard. Why are they there and what could be done to prevent them?
Gotcha. So fire ants, once they become established, do kind of proliferate through the landscape. They do really like warmth, so they do tend to put their mounds kind of closer to pavement, so like walkways and things like that, and near the base of plants, just because they're a little more sheltered from other species as well. So, if you're in a county that has fire ants, I would highly recommend that you reach out to your county cooperative extension office, which I can drop a link to in the chat. Um, they're really the best people to talk to in terms of management for any established species.
Thank you. Another question we have is, do the yellow-legged hornets kill adult honeybees just to eliminate competition?
So with yellow-legged hornet, they're actually going in and trying to harvest the larva, and they feed on the larva of the honeybees. So, um, yeah, it's a little more uh, malicious, I guess, than even just eliminating competition, unfortunately. So.
Thank you. A question that I have is, doing yard work and things like that, we'll utilize the yard waste center mulch over off of New Bern Avenue here in Raleigh.
Okay.
Is that a concern, seeing how a lot of this stuff is pretty undetectable? A lot of these species are undetectable until they get infested. Like, what is a recommendation with things of that nature?
Gotcha. That's a good question. So, with when you're getting things locally and things that have been sourced locally, we're not as concerned about spread. Um, so, for instance, with firewood, we encourage folks to, not travel long distances with firewood, buy it where you burn it, to avoid moving things. With things that have been mulched, that can reduce a lot of risk for potential, like wood boring species like Asian longhorn beetle. Um, they actually have a mulcher in several of the quarantine areas to deregulate that material. They call it, basically making sure that Asian longhorn beetle wouldn't be able to survive that process. Um, and then with some of the other species like fire ant, because we're already within a quarantine county, those things can be moved without regulatory oversight within the quarantine area. Um, However, there may be some things that the mulch producer could do to prevent that movement. So I hope that answers your question.
It does. Thank you. And then we have time for about one more question, and I have one in the chat that asks, is the Asian needle ant an emerging invasive species issue in North Carolina?
So it's not one that we work with too much in the plant industry division because it's not a direct plant pest. Whereas with fire ant, it can get into rootstock in the soil as well. Um, but I do know that there is NC State has an ant specialist, an urban entomology specialist that just started, Chris Hayes. He's starting to do some more work on ants of that nature. And I believe he has some info coming out on Asian needle ant soon. So,
Awesome. Well, we're right at 8 o'clock. I thank you for the presentation. I found it very informational. And we will be sharing this recording if I can get my technology to work. I know we've been having some issues over the past couple months with technology. So I'm hoping to try that we're getting things figured out on my side with IT. And I will be sending out an email by the end of the week with the EE forms for those that need that as well. Amy, thank you again, and I hope you've all enjoyed tonight.
all right. Thank you all.
Looks like we have Julie typing a message. I'm not sure